Welcome to the Metaphorosis magazine podcast, your home for beautifully made speculative fiction. The magazine is edited by B. Morris Allen, and I'm your host, Matt Gomez. This month's story is The Fairgrounds by Thomas Ha. Thomas Ha is a former attorney turned stay-at-home father who enjoys writing speculative fiction during the rare moments when all of his kids are napping at the same time. Thomas grew up in Honolulu, and after a decade plus of living in the Northeast, now resides in Los Angeles. Find him online at thomasHaWrites.com or on Blue Sky at thomasha.bsky.social. Let's jump in. Young boys in love will do stupid and dangerous things. Henry's grandmother had warned him of it that night when he was headed to the fairgrounds alone, now that he'd finally reached the age to attend unaccompanied. She had wrapped his olive green scarf around his neck and lowered his wool cap, and looked into his eyes to say that thing about boys in love because she seemed to sense why he was going and whom he was going for. So I'm not allowed? What? To the fairgrounds? You're not going to let me go? I didn't say that, his grandmother answered, and she hesitated, as if she wanted to say something more, but wiped her hands on a dish towel and pursed her lips instead. Just take care, Henry. That's all. Now go before it gets too late. And so Henry left, first walking, then running out the back door. He scooped up his bike and hopped on and pedaled down the crooked and hilly street, squeezing his handlebars while the crisp, not quite winter prickled his ungloved hands. His cheeks and his chest felt unusually warm. He was too excited to feel any tightness in his legs as he pedaled past the sheriff's station, and the children's park, and the Main Street shops. Henry thought only of her as he rode to the fairgrounds. Seeing her, like a kind of apparition in the darkened sky, or in the branches of the maples along the houses. The girl who sat at the school desk just 2 seats in front of him, over by the window, with light glossing the river of dark hair that ran down her back. Greta. She had only joined Henry's class recently, in the early leaf-laden days of October. Her family had moved to the town from somewhere far, like Oregon, which to Henry was just a word, like Europe or Babylon. But those days since her arrival had been filled with a new kind of slow wonder for Henry, and many quiet daydreams about the kind of person she might be. He had heard someone say she was Michael McCormick's cousin, or maybe related to the Changs who lived across the street from the library. But he had never gotten close to asking about her. Every time she turned to pass papers back, he dared only look at her for a second, then down again at his desk before her eyes could ever meet his. It was just her name and its sound repeated in his thoughts, like some secret part of the Hail Mary that no one had taught him. Greta. The blurred glow of the fairground lights just beyond the town center rose as he pedaled uphill, pushing harder to meet the crest where laughter and music were beginning to grow louder. Henry dropped his bike next to a railing and fumbled with the chain. Unable to find his lock, he decided just to tie it and hastily hid the wrapped links under the body of the bike. When Henry reached the entrance flags, he dug into his pockets and carefully unfolded the $17 he had saved from cleaning yards and moving Mr. O'Leary's garage boxes. The bills felt hot in his hand. Greta. The ticket taker materialized next to the meter. Colors flashed and jarring music blared as his mustachioed face lit the air and crackled. Welcome, welcome to the fairgrounds, son. If you'd kindly scan your ID tag down at the screen and follow the prompts. Henry swiped his wrist tag and fed $4 into the machine for a child's ticket. Thanks, Henry. Are your folks here with you by any chance? No, but I'm old enough, like my ID tag says, 12 and a half. Ah, yes, I can see your tag information here. The image of the ticket taker blinked and crackled. But unaccompanied minors can only stay until 8, which, well, that's coming up very soon. I'm not sure I should be letting you in, really, with how close the first closing is, but... Henry held his breath for just a moment, and then the face filled with light looked left and right and gave him a little smile. But okay, Henry. You go on ahead. Just be quick, understand? You've got less than an hour before they have to escort you out. Go on, go on. The ticket taker winked. Thank you, Henry said, in almost a shout, and hurried onto the grounds. His shoes squished almost immediately into wet mud matted with grass and hay, and every step grew slower as he trudged through, trying to get his bearings. Teenage couples held hands and whispered the way young lovers did in the movies. Above, where the bright hanging bulbs bled light upward into the darkness, Henry saw the holographic projections of people riding one of the twisting glare coasters. They were screaming and whooping from one of the tents below, where their bodies were strapped into rows of chairs with immersive goggles and sensor beads. Near one of the booths, a girl younger than Henry was eating a giant blue synthesized cotton candy, ripping tufts away and stuffing her face while her parents took pictures of her. The three of them were dressed in down coats, nice ones, with no loose threads or missing buttons. Henry watched them, the way they talked and laughed, and he thought about buying one of those cotton candies too, before remembering why he was here. Are you going tonight, Henry? To the fairgrounds? Henry had almost missed her question that afternoon when Greta tapped his shoulder, right there, in a soft spot next to his collarbone. She had been out in the hallway, holding her books to her chest, and in the hours since he imagined the moment again and again, her in front of him like that. Her eyes, big, and maybe only in his mind, with a hint of sadness in them. My father, he won't let me go, but I hear it's fun. Is that true? That it's a lot of fun to go when they pass through the town in the fall? Yes, it's fantastic. And that was it, really. All he had managed to say before she left, waving as she went off to find someone. It was probably no longer than half a minute, if even that. But that little tap on the shoulder, that question, was how the idea, small at first, had begun to grow. The idea Henry had of showing Greta the fairgrounds, even if her father wouldn't allow her to go there herself. He'd find a way to bring a piece of it for her, he thought. He was old enough now, knew enough now, to buy something like that. Maybe a toy or a streamer or something else. That could work. Something small and perfect that would impress her. That was the plan. Are you going to the fairgrounds? Yes. It's fantastic. Fantastic. And there it was, right where Henry had hoped. The virtual text crawled up and down the electronics of the tent fabric, the way it had the year before, and the year before that, and the year before that. The incomparable, incorrigible, illimitable Professor Diedrich von Kempelen, numinous miracle maker and physiker extraordinaire. Henry knew that if he had any hope of bringing Greta something she would like, it would be here, with this man, the one everyone called Professor DVK. The boy passed through the canvas threshold and into the little world of the professor's curiosities. Much of it was unchanged since the last time Henry had been inside, as though the fair had never left town and the tent hadn't moved an inch. There was that strange and oily smell, like a doctor's office combined with a perfume shop his grandmother would visit. And on each side, a series of tables and shelves displaying every manner of delights from faraway lands. A mummified hand with a bionic eye in its palm waved from its jar of preserving liquid. In a terrarium, a metallic snake slithered its segmented body over and around a gnarled branch. There were all kinds of unusual devices and containers cluttering the tabletops and crowded under chairs. And, at the back of the tent, there he was. The man whose every thought and idea were manifested within the circumference of this little canopy, Professor DVK, sitting in the deepest meditative peace, so that he almost seemed to be asleep, with smoke rising from his pipe in concentrated, uniform puffs. Oh. The professor opened one eye slowly to look at Henry, then the other eye quickly. And there was a squeal from the microphone in his throat box as the professor jerked to his feet. The faintest hint of light surged through the portion of his skin. Well, hello there. Yes, hello there, hello. The professor straightened and smoothed his jacket lapels. Welcome, please. Yes, come in, come in. Don't be shy, don't be shy. How may I help you this fine evening? The boy's tag information flashed in his pupils briefly. Henry. Hello, Professor, Henry began. aware of the fact that first closing was drawing in, and he looked here and there at the professor's contraptions for something he might buy. "I'm so glad I made it, because I don't have much time. I was hoping to find something nice, for a gift," Henry explained. "Oh, a gift." The professor's eyes flashed again, probably reviewing whatever information the Fairgrounds had stored on Henry from previous visits or from publicly available data. "For your grandmother, perhaps?" "What?" Henry's face went red. "No, for someone else. A friend." "Ah." Professor DVK stroked his beard. "A friend. I see, Henry. Well, there are many types of friends and many types of gifts. What type of person is this friend of yours? What do they like?" "I'm not sure," the boy said, speaking the realization aloud. "Well, what are their interests?" "I'm not sure." "What seems to excite them?" "I'm not sure." "This is a most difficult task then for you, isn't it?" The professor stood and paced around the inside of the tent. "Because, you know as well as I do, the act of giving a gift is about reception, how it is interpreted, what it signifies, not to you but to them. And that's a near impossible thing to know when you get right down to it. Not just in this instance, but in general. How well do we ever know anyone else, Henry? How well do we know anyone? Not well at all. No, we do not." Henry wasn't sure how to respond to the professor, so he nodded along. "Look, Henry, you're a shining scion of the suburbs, practically full grown. So I think you are old enough to understand that I could string you along with something, if I really wanted, if I were the kind of man to do that sort of thing. I could offer you any of these trinkets or baubles or ingenious inventions and sell you some half-concocted story. Like, say, this neon-spinning cyber wheel. Forged with schematics from the ancient bricoleur masters of the West, I might tell you. Or this hanging chime, designed using sonic sutras to find frequencies most pleasing to every individual. But, listen, you would see through it, Henry, and I'm not that sort of person, despite how I may appear and what they might be saying about me out there. You'll get no silly stories, no misleading mumbo-jumbo, no flim-flam from me." Henry did not know who or what the professor was talking about, but he kept nodding, thinking only that he would have been perfectly happy with either the wheel or the chime the professor had mentioned. The wheel or the chime would have made a perfectly good gift for Greta, he thought. "You must understand, Henry. As a gentleman of the Order of Perpetual Exchange, I couldn't possibly sully my reputation by giving you just any old novelty for whatever amount of petty cash you happen to bring. I take this completely seriously, such that every customer's wish matters as if they were my own. Henry. Oh, dear boy. Henry. How much do you have on you, by the way?" Henry held out what remained in his pockets, the $13 that were left after the entrance fee. "Oh, child." The professor plucked each of the bills from Henry's hands and unfolded them on his desk. "I'm not even sure we have anything that would fit your humble means. But perhaps that in itself is a blessing, because it rules out most of what I probably would have suggested. A blessing, yes." Henry felt a little bit of a sinking feeling in his stomach upon hearing the professor say this, and in his mind that place where he saw Greta next to the classroom window felt almost as if it was beginning to darken. That idea of her, that apparition, fading in and out of his mind, waning with the hope that he might have something to give her. "But wait!" The professor slapped the table. "I do have something, Henry. Yes, it might not be quite right, but it would fit matters like this, Henry. Yes." The man's excitement, his energy filled Henry with a small burst of possibility, and like that, he could see Greta right there, by the window in his mind again. "What is it, Professor?" "Come with me." The man laid a hand gently on Henry's shoulder and guided the boy over to one side of the tent, past several large cases and dummies dressed in sweeping robes and costumes, near a big shape that Henry initially thought to be furniture. "Have you heard of the Castanherts, Henry?" Henry had not, and he told the professor so. Professor DVK waved a hand at the large metal box, which was about the size of a wardrobe and covered in a series of tubes and blinking lights. This here, Henry, is the apex of artistry, distilled. Forward-looking fantasy fuel. In a word, the future. The Kasten Hertz is engineered to analyze your innermost thoughts. It reads your spirit, your essence, by divining it from the air, the ambiance, like the most mystical of antennae. It takes the information, interpolates, collates, consecrates, and then voila. It reimagines and gives you not what you think you want, but what it knows you need, Henry. And that's its true genius, my boy, because needs are tricky. They're never what we suspect. The devil lies in expectation as easily as disappointment. None of us want happy, per se, not in the strictest sense. We want difficulty, intrigue, excitement, triumph. The beauty of the Kastenherz is that it interprets that for you. A test run. Let's give it a test run. We won't count this one to start, understand? What's your friend's name? Greta? The professor hurried to the side of the large machine and fiddled with a few buttons and sliders. Yes, the man muttered. A wheel and series of cogs turned in one quadrant of the box. In another part, something like pistons moved up and down. Henry watched as pixels danced on a small screen, forming different shapes. A heart, a skull, a horse, and then a moon. Professor DVK clapped and howled with an infectious enthusiasm, and then they watched a piece of paper emerge from a thin slat into a tray near the bottom of the box. The professor snatched it and then handed it over to Henry with a cheerful smile. The paper read, "Come, you, cross the autumnal divide, sleeping and walking toward the sundered boars. No one knows their origins, but you wonder how they once all sang. And you reach for beautiful reliquaries beyond holy grasping delight, while Arion watches and holds men to the river, filling their broken heads with dreams. Oh, Greta, you Greta, know only what skies hold in our way of going. Cross those divides. Margaret Sundries purchases 20% off on Sundays. Greta, sweet Greta. If only there were other ways to know the mind except sleep. Then perhaps we would know your peace, Greta." What? Henry stared. Professor DVK's plastered smile did not bulge. Professor, I don't know how to thank me. A beautiful poem for a beautiful girl. The Kastenherz knows, see? This is what you give a friend like yours. I don't know what this means, and it's not her name. Her name? It's wrong. Her name is Greta. Grete. It's an E at the end. Well, you didn't specify, Henry. He clucked his tongue. And it's just a test, a warm-up like I said, so don't worry yourself with details like an E or an A. Miracles come in miles, not in minutiae. I don't know what that means. They were interrupted then by a movement at the entrance. A little girl, the same little girl outside that Henry had seen eating synthesized cotton candy, had come bounding in with her father and mother, all well dressed and clean and happy. Professor DVK's eyes were noticeably drawn to them as information, important seeming information, flashed by in his pupils. Professor, One moment, Henry. I must see to these fine people for a minute or two. But, Professor, Henry cried and grabbed his hand. The first closing. They're going to make me leave the fairgrounds soon. Henry? The professor's smile was gone, and the excitement and mirth in his voice evaporated, as if it had never been there. And it was slight, but everything from his eyes to his posture hardened when he looked down. There are rules, an order of priority. You know how these things work. So wait your turn, and after I see to them, we will finish up with you. Understand? The professor shook Henry off, picked up the corners of his mouth into a big smile, and then turned to face the incoming family with joyfully open arms and talk of the wonders he planned to show them in short order. Henry, meanwhile, stared at the piece of paper from the machine. He couldn't bring himself to look at the professor or anyone. He couldn't even bring himself to think of the classroom window and Greta for comfort. That proud feeling he'd imagined, that puff of power when he presented her with the perfect gift, shrank and shriveled. Foolish, stupid, useless, small. Henry's eyes began to feel wet, and despite his best efforts, it felt like he was going to cry. "I'm sorry. He's an asshole." A voice spoke, barely audible, while the professor continued to laugh and shout with the father of the little family at the other side of the tent. Henry did not know where the voice had come from, but he turned toward the machine. He couldn't explain it, but he was filled with the strangest certainty that there was something else in the machine, living there, and it was speaking to him now. "Yes, Henry, that's right. I am in here," the voice said. "And I'm sorry about the misspelling. The output, the specific words, that's his doing, not mine." "Oh," said Henry quietly. That's okay. He's like this often, by the way, the professor. Nice and inviting, until he's not." "It's fine," Henry replied, even if he didn't feel that way. "Look, you have to go soon, right? Before first closing, you said?" the voice asked. "Can you help me? Please? Can you get me out of this thing? Take me with you?" Henry felt a compulsion, a curious pull in his thoughts, drawing him closer to the machine where there was a small area of darkened glass. Something floated behind it. "He won't let me go." "Won't let you go?" "My father. And I just want to get out, just for a little while. But you'll help me, won't you? Please? It would mean everything to me." Something about the way the voice spoke seemed familiar to Henry, like someone he knew. He touched a small button next to the glass and it slid open. There was something on an interior shelf, but nothing like anything he'd ever seen before. Like a large egg, but made out of flesh-colored clay. The egg turned, and a mouth in its skin smiled at him. "There's a way out the back," the egg said, its voice clear now that the glass was open. "Take me, and we'll get out of here. Quick!" Henry looked at the professor, who was still talking and laughing with the family. First closing was almost upon them, and Henry knew that Professor DVK wasn't going to help him. Not now. Henry had seen things like this before, when he was with his grandmother in town. The way people in the stores and the parks would talk to the other kids with mothers and fathers in nice coats. The way their gaze always drifted around and away from him. And something about knowing that the professor was like them too made Henry's heart burn with a cold anger, something new he didn't recognize. "Let's go," the egg said. "Not much time. Come on." Henry could almost hear his grandmother in his mind, a warning not to do what he knew he was going to do. That moment when he snatched the egg and then walked out the back exit, hurrying around a few more turns until he reached a gap in the shadows of the tents where no one seemed to be around. He placed the thing, the egg from the Castanhertz, on the wet grass, and it shook. Something seemed to be happening within the little thing. An eye swam next to another above the mouth. Then came the lump of a nose. Then more solid parts, like the clay that made up its shell was growing and expanding. After a few moments and a strange popping noise, Henry recognized a face formed from what used to be the egg. A face he had seen many times in his thoughts. Greta. The egg looked like the girl from Henry's class now. Or it looked like Greta's head, at least, with long hair spilling out on the grass, except instead of a glossy black, the hair was a soft white, like January frost. "Thank you, Henry," the head that looked like Greta's said. "Could you pick me up?" "What?" "It's okay. Pick me up. We have to keep moving." Henry lifted the head, then looked around worriedly, but none of the people over by the walkway seemed to be paying attention to him at all. Perhaps distracted by more interesting and fantastical things in the main grounds. He thought to remove his olive green scarf and carefully wrapped the head in it, leaving enough room for the head to breathe. And then he went backwards, slowly, behind the tents, where rays of light from the main areas barely reached. "What a relief." The head that looked like Greta with white hair smiled. "He never lets me stroll around like this. Out here, you know? Forever. It feels like forever since I've been out of the box. Thank you. You're welcome, the boy whispered, finding it odd to be looking at the face he'd imagined for so long, resting now in his arms. He was stunned by it, this thing from the Castenherts, whatever it was, and how easily it seemed to change its form. And don't worry, Henry. I'm going to help you, too. With Greta, you mean? Keep going. That way. Henry realized he was headed to parts of the fairground he didn't usually go to. From between the tents, he could see dozens of fairgoers gathered together, talking very loudly, some holding cups and others of them dancing. He'd heard of this place set aside for the older fairgoers, the social square. Many of the people there were wearing holographic masks, hiding themselves with strangely lit disguises. There were a few who looked like they had giant bug heads, with clicking mandibles that dripped when they spoke. An older boy, much older, maybe 15 or 16, turned the collar of his mask on and flipped through the presets until he made his head into a 20th century automobile. Cat people, bird faces, cartoon eyeballs were making noise. A kind of charged, excitable discussion like at a party. And in the distance, by a bent oak, Henry recognized Father Joyce from the school chapel by his clergy shirt. He seemed to be dancing with a tall, very tall, maybe genetically enhanced person. And this person was wearing a mask of some kind of beast with curved horns, giggling and squeezing at Father Joyce's back. For a short time, Henry tried to imagine Greta there too. He tried to picture how the two of them might wander out into that crowded area under the blaring trumpet music. How they would try on masks, or dance, or talk like the older kids and grown-ups were doing over there. But he couldn't quite see it, and the air felt too hot and noisy. Something about those people and what they were doing made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't say exactly why. You can feel it, the head wrapped in Henry's arm said. The emptiness in them. That doesn't go away. It just builds, you know. Oh. He had heard many stories about the social square over the years, but this was all very different from what he had thought it would be. So Henry kept moving, further away from the music, deciding he didn't want to see much more of this part of the fair. He wanted to know where they were going, but he sensed that the head would lead them, and that he would know soon enough. Under the walkway lights in the distance, Henry watched men made of stained glass performing for a small crowd. They banged against one another in mock battle. Again, until one of them shattered and the people clapped. We're almost there, Henry. And we'll find something there? A gift? Not exactly, the head smiled. When I read you from inside the Castenherts, do you know what I saw, Henry? What? Greta. Henry was embarrassed, trying not to think of the image he'd been holding on to, of the girl by the classroom window, because he knew the head could probably see it too, with whatever talents it used to read his mind in the professor's tent. Yes, the head laughed. That was part of it. That girl was part of what I saw. But what you wanted, it wasn't really about her under the surface. Like you told the professor, you don't know her, her interests, her likes. No, Henry. What you want is something else. What's that? The head didn't answer. We're here. The sound of the fairgrounds seemed muffled and small. They were by a large black tent at the end of the lot, surrounded by darkness, crates, and trash. The mud here felt thicker, like pitch oozing from the edges of the black canvas, and everything smelled ripe and heavy, nothing like the candied air and popcorn where the crowds were. We're here to pay our respects. Come on. Henry didn't know what that meant, but again, he felt that feeling he had at the professor's place, a nudging in his thoughts, like the head that looked like Greta was prodding him. He followed the prodding, into the musty dark of wherever this was. Everything in the fairgrounds runs on flash, the head told Henry, and my father likes it, to pretend that it's all modern miracles and machines. He hides the messy things from before, like me and others. He doesn't want people to know how old it all is, I suspect. And so he chases that bright flame of youth that's always just around the corner. The trends, the fashions, desires, and tastes, always flickering, always changing, depending on the moment. Before the holographic, there was cybernetic. Before cybernetic, mechanical. Before mechanical, there was us. As his eyes adjusted, Henry realized there were solid metal bars not so far to his left, and something long and scaly shifted behind them. To his right, another set of metal bars, and behind them, 3 golden eyes looked out at him. He continued forward, trying not to get too close to any one of what he assumed were cages, unsure what kind of animals were moving about within. Until eventually, they reached a large, dimly lit cage in the center of the tent. A very big creature, with its back to them, slowly turned. And at first, Henry thought it was a man he was looking at. There were muscles and shadow that looked like a torso and long forearms extending into massive hands. But instead of a face staring back at Henry, it was the maned head, long muzzle, and wet nostrils of a horse. For a brief second, Henry thought that this was a person with a holographic mask, like the people in the social square. But there were no streaks of light, no glare, no trickery of that kind. The horse-headed man was nothing like Henry had ever seen or heard or read about, and a part of him was certain that this thing, and maybe all the things within the black tent, were not creatures he would find anywhere else. "Kneel," the head that looked like Greta whispered. So Henry did. The horseman leaned into the small patch of light from a hanging bulb, its black eyes drinking in everything in that tent, including the boy and the small head he carried. Henry felt that the other animals in the shadows of the tent were all watching carefully. "He's the oldest of us, the strongest, but also the tiredest." The head smiled. "He doesn't like being cooped up back here in this tent. Hasn't for a long time. Like me in the box, I felt it. So, he and I, we share a certain kind of understanding, I think." There was a chill in the air. Henry heard sounds that weren't exactly sounds. Echoes he thought might be of the thing that looked like Greta, talking somehow to the horseman without words. The horseman breathed heavily through its mouth, and those eyes, like pools of reflective oil, studied them for a while. "Yes," the head that looked like Greta said. "No. Yes. I promise." The horseman's face loomed above Henry, silent. "Yes." The horseman shifted, just slightly, but it was enough that Henry began shaking involuntarily. The creature did not lunge, only moved its heavy body closer to the bars. Then the horseman extended a large wrinkled hand with its palm upward. "Go on," the head that looked like Greta said. "Give me to him, Henry. It's okay." The boy was afraid, but he was more afraid of disobeying. He unwrapped his scarf and raised the head, placing it into the huge palm in front of him, and the frosty hair streamed down between the creature's calloused fingers. The head that looked like Greta started quivering, much like it had when it changed its shape before, outside the tents. The edges of the head puffed, expanded, and the skin of Greta's face seemed to stretch and latch onto the horseman's giant hand. The fleshy parts kept growing, seeming to swallow up the large fingers and palm. "Close your eyes, Henry," the head said. And Henry closed his eyes. "Greta," he said to himself. "Greta, Greta." He thought of the window, streaming light, wooden desks, dark hair. He imagined her 2 seats in front of him, looking out, looking back. A smile. He tried to ignore the sounds of loud and rapid breathing coming from the cage ahead. He tried to ignore the strange roars, the chattering, the screeches starting to rise from other cages in other parts of the tent too, crescendoing. "Greta, Greta, Greta." That secret part of the Hail Mary he recited to drown out the noise, growing louder and more intense, like it was all whirling around his head. "Greta, Greta, Greta." Again and again and again. And then everything stopped. There was only the weight of silence and stillness, and a small familiar voice. "Okay, Henry, you can look." Henry didn't want to, and he waited. But eventually he did open his eyes. When he did, he saw that the cage was empty. The horseman, whatever it was, or whatever it had been, had vanished. And instead, in front of the cage, next to him, she stood. The thing, so much like Greta. Her hair soft and bright like the moon. A neck, shoulders, arms, legs, and wearing a white dress like most girls wore to church. "All done," the girl said, as lumps of skin seemed to rise and sink near her throat. There was some kind of movement there, inside of her, that made Henry look away. He tried to peer into the shadows, toward the other darker edges of the black tent, and he realized the other cages, what he could make of them, seemed to be empty too. "Did you hurt them?" he finally asked. Not Greta shook her head. "Of course not. I'm helping them, like you helped me, just in a different sort of way." Henry did not know what that meant, or what had happened, but he was too afraid to ask and too scared to look around any further. "Come on," Not Greta laughed, and she reached out and held Henry's hand. She was warm, small, and gentle. He focused intently on her hand. "Let's go." He followed her, out of the black tent, out under the stars. She interlaced her fingers with his and led him back toward the house and the movement and the people walking. The laughter and the lights out here felt strange now to Henry, having seen what was back there in the dark. But he kept on walking. A loud chime rang over the fairgrounds to announce the first closing. A number of children and families were going in a slow throng toward the entrance flags together. Not Greta squeezed Henry's hand and leaned on him, and he felt relaxed, fuzzy, like he was in some kind of dream. The two of them walked between those others, shuffling, and Henry saw Professor DVK, far off, standing in front of his tent, scanning the grounds like he was looking for something. The professor's eyes reached them, and he froze, his body perfectly still. The professor's face blanched, and something flashed in his pupils as he stood there. Henry wasn't sure, but he thought the professor recognized something in Not Greta, something that made him too terrified to say or do anything as they walked away. The professor seemed so small to Henry then, just a withered version of the man in the tent, smaller and smaller in the distance, until they left him behind completely. When they reached the outside of the entrance, Not Greta took Henry over to his bike, still unchained, and propped it up for him. She looked into his eyes and smiled sweetly. "Thank you, Henry, for tonight. We won't forget this, you know," she whispered, and for a brief moment Henry thought he heard other voices in the wind that softened and were swallowed by the crinkling of leaves. "Anytime you need us, anytime at all, we will be there for you. Just think it and we will come. We mean it. We promise." Henry stuttered, unsure of his words. He looked at her face, so much like Greta, but so clearly something else, leaning forward to press her lips gently against his cheek, and he felt his face burn. Then she turned, like she was tracking the shapes of the people nearby, and there was the family from the professor's tent earlier, nice and clean, the father, the mother, and the little girl. And Not Greta had a strange expression on her face as she followed them with her eyes, which appeared darker than before. Henry didn't like that look in her for some reason. "Good night," she said. "Good night. Think about what we said, Henry. About what you wanted. What you really wanted when you were looking for that gift of yours." She smiled. "You already got it, you know." Henry didn't understand, but before he could ask her, Not Greta walked away, like an animal slinking into the night. He wondered if she meant it, what she had said, about being there when he needed her. Always there. Somewhere. And part of him felt happy about that, but another part, a smaller part of him, felt unusually cold. Henry trudged away from the fairgrounds, down the hill and up another, pulling his bike in a daze. When he returned, everything was bright and warm inside his grandmother's house. He felt too tired to talk, but he went to the kitchen where his grandmother was waiting. She had prepared a bowl of rice soup and watched as he shed his cap and scarf and sat silently eating. She somehow seemed to know that he didn't want to say much, and so she didn't pry or ask how things went. After he'd finished and gotten ready for bed, his grandmother was there to press his blankets over him and brush the hair from his eyes, talking to him as she often did while he got sleepier and sleepier. "The fairgrounds are strange," he heard his grandmother say. "Like everything out there. Heavy, their strangeness." "Yes," Henry said softly. "There's no hiding that from you," his grandmother said. "The more you go out, the more you'll see. Not just in the fairgrounds, but everywhere else too. The fairgrounds are just a concentrated piece of it, a symbol of whatever else there is out there." "Yes," he agreed. "And it's not always good, not always bad. It's just there, everywhere. And you find it and make things of it as you go on in life. We all have to." "Yes," he said. "You have to be careful with what you make of it. Promise me you'll be careful, because I can't do it for you." Henry's grandmother searched his eyes, like she had some notion of what he'd been through, but not enough to ask him in detail. And Henry had the feeling that this might be the way it would have been between them, not just for this, but other things to come. "I promise," he said. "You've had a day, I can see, so I'll let you rest. Good night, Henry. Good night. I love you very much, little one." "I love you too." The room went dark, and Henry stared drowsily at the ceiling. Somewhere in his mind, he felt the faintest glimmers of light and the softest sounds of distant music drifting over. He thought again about what his grandmother had said, about the fairgrounds as a kind of symbol, the strangeness it contained, the exciting, the frightening, the heartbreaking and the fun. And he imagined, beyond the house, the fairgrounds, and even the town, more bright and empty things he might one day find. Soft and precious things, too. In a dull and ever-present ache that joined everything together. These hazy thoughts filled him with a distant ease, but there was also, underneath it, a quiet sense that something terrible had happened tonight. Something important that he might have had a part in but did not fully understand. Not Greta had said he'd gotten what he'd wished for, and the more he thought about that, too, and about Greta, the more part of him realized it had never really been a girl, or a gift for her, that he had yearned for. Not really. He would see her again on Monday, and the day after, there in the classroom. And maybe they would talk more, but more likely they wouldn't. His young mind would drift wherever it would drift next, and his brutal sense of her would fall away like the crackling leaves before the season's end. Like the fairgrounds, Henry thought. The longing he thought he felt might have really been a piece of something else, of knowing things, and of growing older, and of becoming more like all the others, of growing up. Henry dropped further into the fullness of sleep, and as he did, he tried to imagine the familiar window again, and the desk near where the light fell. He tried to see the girl that sat there, the way he had before, but the memory of her already felt insubstantial, like smoke. Greta, he thought. Greta, he prayed. Greta, he dreamed. Less a boy, less a child, he grasped for it, the feeling that had been in him before. Greta. But he wasn't sure he would ever find that same feeling again. That was The Fairgrounds by Thomas Ha. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you'd leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you listen to us on. Or better yet, share the magazine and podcast with a friend. If you'd like to listen to more speculative fiction, visit us online at magazine.metaphorosis.com, on Blue Sky at metaphorosis.bsky.social, or on Mastodon at metaphorosis@writing.exchange.